Imagine this: a handful of merchants, dressed in plain coats, sailing across the seas with nothing but trade goods and ambition, and within a few generations, they would bring one of the greatest civilizations on earth to its knees. This isn't the story of a country invading another with armies and kings. This is the story of a company that raised its own armies, made its own laws, and eventually ruled over millions of people. This is how the East India Company took over an entire country. It all began in 1600. England was still a rising power, not yet the empire it would later become. The Queen signed a royal charter granting a group of London merchants the exclusive right to trade in the East Indies. These men weren't soldiers, and they weren't kings, they were businessmen. But they carried something far more dangerous than swords: the hunger for profit. At first, the East India Company was nothing more than a trading venture. They set up small factories and warehouses along the coast of India, buying spices, silk, and cotton, and selling them in Europe for enormous profits. The Mughals, who ruled India at the time, allowed them to trade so long as they followed the empire's rules. And for a while, that's all it was: business. But business has a way of turning into power. The company built fortified trading posts in places like Surat, Madras, and Calcutta. They weren't just trading anymore. They were digging in. They hired guards, built walls, and armed themselves. What was supposed to be merchants with cargo ships was slowly transforming into merchants with warships. And here lies the first twist of the story. The East India Company realized that India was not just a land of spices and textiles, it was a land of wealth, fertile soil, and people. And whoever controlled India could control unimaginable riches. So how did a group of foreign merchants transform into rulers of India? The answer is deception, manipulation, and a brutal game of divide and conquer. And that game was just beginning. India in the 1600s and 1700s was a vast and diverse land. The Mughal Empire still stood, but its power was fading. Provinces were breaking away, regional rulers were growing stronger, and rival kingdoms were constantly at war. To most people, this looked like chaos. But to the East India Company, it looked like opportunity. The company knew it couldn't conquer India outright. They didn't have enough men, enough soldiers, or enough authority. But what they did have was money, weapons, and a ruthless strategy: divide and conquer. They began lending their armies, small but well-trained and well-armed, to local princes and rulers. A warlord in Bengal wants to fight his rival? The company would provide cannons, muskets, and even European officers in exchange for trading privileges, land, or money. A Nawab in the south wanted to crush his enemies? The company would step in, then quietly take more than they gave. This strategy was deadly because it worked both ways. Not only did Indian rulers become dependent on the company's firepower, but they also weakened each other. Every time a kingdom turned to the company for help, it was another nail in India's independence. But the company didn't stop at playing kingmaker. They began manipulating politics outright, bribing ministers, buying loyalty from generals, and planting spies in royal courts. Slowly, they became a shadow power, never seen as rulers, yet always pulling the strings. The real turning point came in Bengal. The wealthiest province in India, Bengal was known as the land of gold and silk. In 1757, the company fought the famous Battle of Plassey. On paper, the Nawab of Bengal had a massive army, far larger than the company's said. But the company had already bribed his top generals. When the battle began, most of the Nawab's forces simply stood still, refusing to fight. The company's victory was swift, decisive, and utterly shocking. From that moment, the East India Company was no longer just a trading power, it was a political power. They didn't just trade in Bengal, they controlled it. They collected taxes, appointed officials, and built a government. A company of merchants had now become a government in disguise. And with Bengal's vast wealth flowing into their coffers, the company grew richer and more powerful than ever before. But here's the dark side. While the company grew fat with riches, the people of India paid the price. After the Battle of Plassey, the East India Company had secured Bengal, the richest jewel in India's crown. The rivers of gold, silk, and spices that once enriched local rulers now flowed directly into the company's vaults. But with great wealth came great hunger for more. The company was not like a king or a nation. It had no duty to its people, no vision for society, no care for culture. It was a business, and like any business, its only goal was profit. Every decision, every policy, every action was driven by one question: how much money can we make? They began taxing Bengal mercilessly. Farmers who once lived in balance with the land were now crushed under impossible demands. Artisans who wove the finest silks and muslins in the world were forced to sell only to the company at rock-bottom prices. Traditional industries collapsed, villages starved, and centuries of craftsmanship were wiped out in just a few decades. The worst came in 1770, when Bengal was struck by famine. Drought had withered the fields, crops failed, and millions of people cried out for help. But the company, instead of easing the burden, kept raising taxes. Grain was hoarded to maintain profits, and prices skyrocketed beyond the reach of ordinary people. The result was catastrophic. An estimated 10 million Indians died. Whole villages disappeared. Skeletons lined the roads. Families sold their children to survive. And yet, while Bengal starved, the company's profits soared. London's investors grew richer. Stockholders celebrated. And the British Parliament watched as India's suffering filled the pockets of its businessmen. This was not conquest by sword, it was conquest by hunger. The East India Company had learned that famine itself could be profitable, but the company's brutality did not go unnoticed. Across India, resentment was rising. Soldiers muttered in discontent. Farmers whispered in anger. Kings who had once used the company as an ally now saw it as a threat. India was simmering, and sooner or later the pot would boil over. Yet, even as rebellion brewed, the company tightened its grip. They expanded westward, fought wars against the Marathas and Mysore, and crushed any ruler who resisted. Their armies, made up mostly of Indian sepoys, local soldiers trained in European tactics, marched under the company's flag, enforcing the very system that enslaved their homeland. The East India Company was no longer just a business. It had become an empire within an empire. But like all empires built on greed and fear, its downfall was only a matter of time. By the early 1800s, the East India Company had spread its shadow across most of India. Bengal, Madras, and Bombay were under its firm grip. The great Maratha Confederacy had been defeated. The powerful kingdoms of Mysore and Hyderabad were tamed. Piece by piece, the company stitched India into its empire of profit, but conquest bred discontent. Behind the facade of power, cracks were beginning to form. The company had stripped kings of their authority, farmers of their land, and artisans of their livelihood. Ancient systems of governance, religion, and culture were being disrupted, and the people of India, though scattered, divided, and diverse, began to feel a common anger. It wasn't just taxes or famine anymore. The resentment was deeper, touching identity and faith. British officials, driven by arrogance, often interfered with local customs. Missionaries tried to spread Christianity. New laws disregarded centuries of tradition. And Indians, proud of their religions and heritage, saw this as an assault on their very way of life. Then came the company's army, the sepoys. They were Indian soldiers, trained in British ways, drilled in British commands, and armed with British weapons. At first, sepoys were loyal, seeing the company as an employer. But slowly, mistrust seeped in. Their pay was low, promotions were rare, and respect was non-existent. British officers treated them as inferior, forgetting that these very sepoys were the backbone of their power. The spark came in 1857. when rumors spread that the new Enfield rifle cartridges were greased with cow and pig fat, sacrilege to both Hindus and Muslims. To load the rifle, sepoys had to bite the cartridge open, directly violating their religious beliefs. It was more than just a rumor, it was the breaking point. On May 10, 1857, sepoys in Meerut mutinied. They shot their officers, freed their comrades, and marched to Delhi. There, they declared the aging Mughal Emperor Bahadur Shah Zafar as the leader of their uprising. Suddenly, what began as a mutiny became something far greater, a war of independence. The fire spread quickly. From Delhi to Kanpur, from Lucknow to Jhansi, Indians rose in rebellion. Farmers joined soldiers, nobles joined peasants, men and women alike took up arms. The legendary Rani of Jhansi, Lakshmi Bai, led her troops with unmatched courage, becoming a symbol of resistance. For the first time, the East India Company faced not just scattered enemies, but a united uprising. But the company, backed by the might of Britain, struck back with brutal force. Villages were burned, thousands were executed, and rivers ran red with blood. The rebellion was crushed, but it shook the foundations of British rule. In its aftermath, the British government stepped in, stripping the East India Company of power. In 1858, the Crown took direct control of India. The company, once the world's most powerful corporation, was dissolved. Yet, the rebellion of 1857 planted seeds that would grow into something larger, a dream of freedom, a sense of unity, and the birth of an Indian identity that refused to be silenced. The year was 1858, and the East India Company, once the most powerful merchant empire in history, was no more. The Great Rebellion of 1857 had exposed its weakness, its arrogance, and its inability to govern such a vast and diverse land. The British Parliament acted swiftly. Through the Government of India Act, the Crown of Britain assumed direct control of India. Queen Victoria was proclaimed Empress, and the British Raj was born. For India, this marked the beginning of a new chapter. No longer would merchants in London dictate policies through their boardrooms. Now, it was the British monarchy itself, with all the machinery of an empire, ruling directly. A viceroy was appointed to represent the crown, based in Calcutta, the new capital of British India. At first, the British promised reform. Queen Victoria's proclamation assured Indians that their religions and traditions would be respected. Officials declared that the crown would not interfere in matters of faith. It was a strategic move meant to heal the wounds left by the mutiny. Yet, beneath these words of conciliation, the grip of empire only tightened. The Raj expanded its bureaucracy, building railways, telegraphs, and postal systems not for the benefit of ordinary Indians, but to strengthen imperial control. The railways moved troops as easily as they moved goods. Telegraph lines allowed the viceroy to communicate instantly with far-off provinces. What looked like progress was often a tool of domination, but there were undeniable changes. India, once a patchwork of kingdoms and princely states, was now more connected than ever before. Cities like Bombay, Calcutta, and Madras grew into hubs of trade and culture. English education spread, creating a new class of Indians who could read, write, and think in the language of their rulers. Ironically, this very education, meant to create loyal clerks for the empire, would one day fuel the fire of nationalism. Still, for the masses, life under the Raj was harsh. Land taxes remained crushing. Famines continued to devastate millions, made worse by British policies that prioritized exports over feeding the hungry. Indian industries, once famous for textiles, crafts, and shipbuilding, were systematically dismantled, leaving India dependent on British imports. The Raj also relied heavily on the loyalty of the princely states. While Britain ruled directly over large parts of India, many regions remained under the control of local kings and princes, who acted as allies of the crown. In exchange for their loyalty, these princes kept their thrones, though their power was limited. This clever system allowed Britain to rule vast territories without constant rebellion. Yet beneath the surface, change was stirring. The new English-educated middle class began questioning British authority. Lawyers, teachers, and journalists, products of the very education system Britain had introduced, started to see India not as a land of kingdoms, but as a nation in the making. They began writing, debating, and organizing. Seeds of nationalism were quietly being planted. For now, however, the Raj stood tall. Britain celebrated India as the jewel in the crown, the richest possession of its global empire. But jewels can be heavy, and beneath its shine, unrest was growing slowly, steadily, and inevitably. By the late 19th century, India had been under the direct rule of the British Crown for several decades. The Raj appeared unshakable, with its armies, railways, and bureaucracy stretching across the subcontinent. But beneath this display of power, something new was taking root. An idea, quiet at first, yet destined to grow into a movement that would shake the very foundations of empire. That idea was nationalism. It began among a small group of Indians, men and women educated in British schools, fluent in English, and familiar with the ideals of liberty, equality, and democracy. They had studied the works of European philosophers, learned about the American Revolution, and admired the struggles of the French people for freedom. And as they looked around their own land, where millions lived in poverty, where industries had been destroyed, and where Indians were treated as second-class citizens in their own country, they began to ask, why not us? Why not India? The British, ironically, had created this class of thinkers without realizing the consequences. They wanted clerks, administrators, and lawyers to help run the empire. What they got were leaders. In 1885, these leaders came together in Bombay to form the Indian National Congress. At first, it was not a revolutionary body. Its founders were moderate, cautious men, lawyers, teachers, journalists, and professionals who believed in working with the British rather than against them. They drafted petitions, held meetings, and demanded modest reforms. More Indians in government service, lower taxes, better treatment under the law. The British dismissed these demands as trivial. Many in London saw the Congress as nothing more than a talking shop. But what they failed to realize was that something extraordinary was happening. For the first time, educated Indians from across regions, religions, and languages were meeting together not as Bengalis or Punjabis, not as Hindus or Muslims, but as Indians. The Congress had planted a seed, the seed of unity. Outside the halls of Congress, however, the reality of colonial rule remained harsh. Famines in the late 19th century killed millions, while British officials continued to export grain overseas. Taxes remained heavy, and Indian peasants saw little relief. Resentment simmered, and younger leaders within the Congress began to grow impatient with moderation. Why beg for reforms when the British clearly had no intention of treating Indians as equals? By the turn of the century, voices of assertiveness began to rise. Leaders like Bal Gangadhar Tilak declared, "Swaraj is my birthright, and I shall have it." Newspapers and pamphlets began spreading the message of self-rule. The movement was still young, but the fire had been lit. The British, uneasy, began to sense the changing mood. They responded with their usual strategy: divide and rule. In 1905, the Viceroy, Lord Curzon, partitioned the province of Bengal, splitting it along religious lines. Publicly, it was justified as an administrative decision. Privately, it was meant to weaken Indian unity by setting Hindus and Muslims against each other. Instead, it had the opposite effect. The partition of Bengal sparked massive protests, boycotts of British goods, and a surge of nationalist pride. Indians began to weave their own cloth, refusing to wear British textiles. For the first time, ordinary people, farmers, shopkeepers, students, women, joined the movement in large numbers. Nationalism was no longer just the dream of educated elites. It was becoming the heartbeat of a people. The British Raj had ruled India with railways and rifles, with bureaucracy, but now it faced something far more dangerous: an awakened nation. By the mid-19th century, India was a nation seething under the weight of company rule. For decades, people had suffered in silence, but anger was building like a storm on the horizon. Farmers were trapped in endless cycles of debt, forced to grow crops they couldn't eat while famine ravaged their families. Soldiers in the company's own army, the sepoys, were treated as second-class men in their own land. Taxes soared, respect vanished, and a growing sense of humiliation spread like wildfire. The East India Company may have thought it was invincible, but the seeds of its downfall were already being planted. The breaking point came in 1857. In what history remembers as the First War of Independence, or the Sepoy Mutiny, what began as a spark in the barracks turned into a raging inferno across the north of India. The cause? Something that seemed small at first glance: rifle cartridges rumored to be greased with cow and pig fat. For Hindu and Muslim soldiers, this was not just offensive. It was a direct assault on their faith. Forced to bite the cartridges open, sepoys saw it as yet another insult, another way the company tried to strip them of dignity and identity. And so, rebellion erupted. In cities like Meerut, sepoys turned their guns on British officers. In Delhi, the last Mughal emperor, Bahadur Shah II, was pulled from obscurity and placed at the head of a movement to reclaim India's freedom. Ordinary peasants joined the uprising, fueled by rage against the oppressive taxes and the hunger that never ended. For a brief moment, it seemed as if centuries of foreign control might crumble under the power of Indian resistance. But the East India Company was not prepared to give up its empire so easily. Brutal retaliation followed. Villages were burned. Rebels were executed in public spectacles meant to terrify, and rivers ran red with blood. The company crushed the uprising with unmatched savagery, but in doing so, it revealed its weakness to the world. For the first time, Britain realized that leaving India in the hands of a profit-hungry corporation was no longer safe. The rebellion may have failed in the moment, but it changed everything. When the smoke cleared, the East India Company was finished. Its greed, its corruption, and its inability to govern had led to a disaster that nearly shattered Britain's most prized possession. In 1858, the British Crown stepped in, dissolving the company and taking direct control of India. The jewel of the empire was too important to be left to merchants. And just like that, the East India Company, the corporation that had once conquered a subcontinent, was gone. But its legacy remained. Centuries of exploitation had reshaped India forever. A land once rich and independent had been forced into poverty, its industries broken, its people divided. The company may have vanished, but the scars it left would take generations to heal. The fall of the East India Company in 1858 was not the end of India's story, it was the beginning of a new chapter. With the company dissolved, power shifted directly into the hands of the British Crown. Queen Victoria declared herself the sovereign of India, promising her subjects justice, fairness, and protection of their traditions. To many, it sounded like a new dawn. But for millions of Indians, little truly changed. The empire had simply changed its face. The British Crown inherited the wealth, the land, and the vast armies the company had built. Railroads, telegraph lines, and canals expanded rapidly, but they were not meant to lift Indians into prosperity. They were designed to extract resources more efficiently, to move raw cotton, tea, opium, and wheat from Indian fields to British factories and markets. Modernization was a tool of empire, polished on the surface, but sharp with exploitation underneath. Life for ordinary Indians grew harsher. Heavy taxation remained, often forcing farmers to grow cash crops instead of food. Famines struck again and again, with millions starving while grain was shipped overseas. The scars of company rule, economic ruin, broken industries, and social division were carried into this new era. But something else began to grow under Crown rule: resistance. The memory of the 1857 uprising lived on in whispers, in songs, in stories passed down from village to village. A new generation of leaders rose, educated in British schools, but deeply rooted in Indian identity. They saw the empire's hypocrisy preaching liberty and democracy in Britain while denying those very rights in India. Slowly, the seeds of nationalism began to sprout. The British tried to tighten control. They played communities against each other, nurturing divisions of caste and religion. They censored voices that dared to speak of freedom. Yet no matter how tightly they held the reins, the spirit of independence refused to die. The company may have fallen, but the crown was now walking the same dangerous path, trying to rule a nation of millions with the same arrogance and greed that had destroyed its predecessor. In this new phase, India was no longer a colony of merchants. It had become the crown jewel of the largest empire in the world. But beneath the glitter of that jewel, the cracks were widening. A people who had endured centuries of exploitation were slowly awakening, preparing for a struggle far greater than any rebellion of the past. The age of the company was over. The age of empire had begun. When the British Crown took over from the East India Company, many thought the era of ruthless exploitation might end. But in truth, the Crown simply refined the company's methods. India remained the beating heart of the British Empire. Its wealth and resources feeding the factories of Manchester, the ports of London, and the growing power of Britain across the world. Yet as the decades rolled on, the very systems the empire built, railways, schools, newspapers, became weapons in the hands of Indians themselves. By the late 19th century, a new generation had risen. Men like Dadabhai Naoroji, who exposed how Britain drained India's wealth, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, who declared that Swaraj is my birthright, and Gopal Krishna Gokhale, who pressed for reform with words sharper than swords. They were joined later by voices like Rabindranath Tagore, who turned poetry into resistance, and Annie Besant, who stirred crowds with calls for self-rule. Out of scattered protests and petitions, a movement began to form the Indian National Congress. The empire, however, was not willing to loosen its grip. Famines continued to devastate the countryside. Industries remained crippled under unfair trade laws. And when Indians protested, they were often met with the rifle and the bayonet. The massacre at Jallianwala Bagh in 1919 was a brutal reminder the empire saw dissent not as a right, but as a threat to be crushed. Hundreds were gunned down in cold blood, their only crime being the dream of freedom, but repression only fueled resistance. Gandhi's arrival on the scene turned the struggle into something the world had never seen before. A fight not with weapons, but with truth, nonviolence, and mass civil disobedience. Millions of Indians, rich and poor, Hindu and Muslim, men and women, stood together in defiance. They marched, they boycotted, they filled prisons, but they refused to yield. Every salt grain picked from the sea, every British cloth burned in protest, every peaceful march was a challenge to the empire's might. By the time the Second World War broke out, the cracks in the empire were too deep to hide. Britain, drained and weakened, could no longer hold back the tide of Indian nationalism. The company's conquest, which had begun with a handful of merchants and soldiers in the 1600s, had set into motion centuries of exploitation. But it had also, unknowingly, forged a nation that now demanded its place in the world. In 1947, 2714, that demand could no longer be denied. The tricolor flag of independent India rose into the sky, and with it, the shadow of both company and crown began to fade. Yet the scars they left: economic divides, political tensions, and the painful partition of India and Pakistan showed that the legacy of conquest would not vanish overnight. The story of the East India Company was over. But the story of India, of resilience, of survival, of freedom hard won, had only just begun. The story of the East India Company is unlike any other in history. It began with a few merchants chasing profit on distant shores, and it ended with the conquest of an entire civilization. What started as trade turned into tyranny. What began with contracts ended with chains. India was not just a colony. It was the jewel that powered an empire. Its wealth carried away, its people forced into submission, its culture reshaped under the weight of foreign rule. And yet, through centuries of exploitation, India did not break. It endured, it resisted, it transformed suffering into strength, and oppression into the fire of freedom. The East India Company may have written the first chapter, but India wrote the last. A nation that was once ruled by traders and soldiers rose again, not just to reclaim its land, but to remind the world that no empire lasts forever. The company is gone, the crown is gone, but India remains vast, diverse, alive, and free. And as we look back on this story, one truth echoes across time. When a people refuse to surrender their spirit, no force, no company, no empire, no crown can hold them forever. If you felt the weight of this history, if you were moved by the story of how a single company changed the fate of millions, then let your voice join ours. Leave a comment, share your thoughts, and help this story reach every corner of the world. And if you believe history must never be forgotten, then like this video, share it, and subscribe for more stories that shaped our world. Because history is not just the past, it is a mirror, and sometimes it's a warning.